We begin today with that ongoing rail dispute, a work stoppage that has massive implications for the Canadian economy. CN and CP move $1 billion worth of goods per day. The CBC's Peter Armstrong joins me now with the latest. Peter, bring us up to speed. How did we get here and where do things stand now?
Well, stand is a good word for it because a lot of things are standing still. We're getting word from CN that in spite of the fact that we've got a strike notice, that they're trying to ramp things back up until the IRB comes down with some kind of ruling and provides clarity around that. On the CP side, they're still challenging that process, and it doesn't look like we're getting much movement there. I've just come from the train station down the street, speaking with commuters that are still stuck in a lot of the backlog that's come as a result of some of the CP rail lines being down. So, look, this has been one of the wildest days in terms of we woke up thinking, okay, federal government stepped in, binding arbitration, that part's solved. The CP rail, the Teamsters that work with CP rail, they've tried to launch something of a challenge. But we're going to start seeing things come back to normal. Very quickly, that kind of went sideways. And now the CN rail strike notice was issued around 10 o'clock this morning. We're now being told the workers for CN rail could be on strike as early as Monday morning at 10 a.m. And there's not a lot of answers. Frankly, JP, right now we're waiting around until we hear from the IRB and get a sense of where we are in that process. That's going to tell us where we are in every other process. And until we do, most of us are really just kind of standing around waiting. Yeah, what could happen next, Peter? I think the main thing we're going to be waiting for is the response from the IRB. Because remember, last night the minister came out and said he's going to order the two sides into binding arbitration, extend their existing contracts. He can't do that. He can ask the IRB to do that, and that's what the hearing that started this morning is meant to do, and get some clarity around that. Until we get that clarity, your guess is as good as mine. And the unions, because the way, kind of technically, the way they did this by extending their existing contract, that opened the door to the CN union saying, well, then we're going to issue a strike notice, and sort of resetting a lot of the expectations that had been resolved last night were all of a sudden not resolved. So a lot of questions. I do wish I had more answers for you. But like I say, I've just talked to a ton of commuters that are upset about this. We've been hearing from, you mentioned $1 billion a day, more than are moved by rail. There's 45,000 kilometers of rail in this country. It is an astounding figure. If you look around your living room, your office, wherever you are right now, most of the stuff around you got to you in some part of its journey to you, came to you by rail. So it is a massive undertaking. It is a massively complicated issue, and it is fraught with politics and expectations. And I think we're just going to have to be patient as we wait for the IRB. All right, thanks, Peter. The CBC's Peter Armstrong in Toronto for us tonight. For more on this story, Gil McGowan is the president of the Alberta Federation of Labour. He's been out on the picket line with rail workers, and he joins me now. Hey, thanks for coming on.
Hey, JP. Good to see you.
Nice to see you too. Thank you. You're speaking out today against the federal government's decision to invoke binding arbitration in this case. You said today Ottawa is rewarding a foreign-owned cartel for its bad behavior. What's wrong with what the government did in this case?
Well, before I start, I just want to make it clear from the outset that I'm not here speaking on behalf of the union. They will do that job for themselves. I'm joining you as an informed observer, someone who's familiar with labor relations in Canada. And the reason I raised concerns about the federal government's decision to send this for binding arbitration is because, like many people in the Canadian labor movement, we just want to remind decision makers that here in Canada, unlike in the United States, striking and collective bargaining are constitutionally protected rights. And these rights should not be cast aside lightly. I think it's also important to point out what the minister did yesterday wasn't exactly ordering binding arbitration. What he said is that under the Canadian Labour Code, he has the right to ask the Canadian Industrial Relations Board, the CIRB, to send it to binding arbitration. And that's what he's done. And he said that in the meantime, the conditions of the existing collective agreements would remain in place. And so right now it's a waiting game. The situation is still unfolding. We don't know what the Industrial Relations Board is going to do with that order. But based on my experience as a longtime labor leader, even if the CIRB does send it to binding arbitration, that is usually a process that takes quite a long time. In fact, just earlier this summer, there was a similar situation with WestJet mechanics. And that situation was sent by the minister to the Industrial Relations Board. And the order at that time, when it was handed down, said that hearings would start within 90 days. So if that happens again, and I think it would, because binding arbitration is not something that happens just with waving a magic wand. The two sides have to present their evidence. There's a panel that has to consider the evidence. It takes at least weeks. And so we don't know if the CIRB is going to, what decision they're going to make. And it's certainly not going to be quick. The reason I criticized the government was because binding arbitration is exactly what CN and CP have been asking for. Basically, it's been clear to me and to other observers that these are two companies, and I want to make it really clear, these, they have Canadian in their name, but in reality, they're two American-based multinational companies whose interest is the bottom line, not the Canadian interest. Right. And they want to impose a very substandard agreement on Canadian workers, thousands of them. And that's really the issue here. I mean, we've got two companies that say that they're short-staffed and that it's affecting service and safety, but instead of making their companies more attractive places to work, they're doing the opposite. What they're asking for is basically to be able to call these workers in at any time, ignoring their needs for time off and time with their families. And they're tearing up they want to tear up existing portions of the agreement that protects scheduling. And for workers who are often working 18-hour shifts, that's a big deal. And
yeah, let me just jump in here. We only have so much time. Let me just ask you, though, do you have any sympathy for what the Labour Minister has said? He says he wants to prevent the economy from being thrown into an economic tailspin. He doesn't want to see all these goods held up. He doesn't want to see the railways go dark for a prolonged period of time. He doesn't want to have knock-on effects for the tens of thousands of workers across the country that rely on some of the goods that move on these railways. He says they've had months to hash this out, the union and the businesses. They have not come to a deal. It's a reasonable request to bring in a third party, to bring in a mediator. Do you not have any sympathy for what the government is in, this position they're in, this difficult position they're in?
I think that the companies have deliberately put the government in a very difficult position. I mean, I think it's important for Canadians to understand that the trains could be running right now. This negotiation could have continued. The unions they've made it very clear that they wanted to stay at the table bargaining, even though that they were still far apart. They felt that the goal would be continue bargaining for a negotiated settlement. The only reason that service was disrupted and continues to be disrupted today is because the company, CP and CN, just decided that they'd had enough. It wasn't that the bargaining couldn't have continued. So this is a choice by the employers, not by the workers. And the second thing I'd say is that if they want trains to run on time, if they want this deal to be done, the company has to take these draconian, family unfriendly demands off the table because they have a worker shortage in these two big companies that are vital to our infrastructure and our economy. That's the issue. But to say that they're going to solve this issue by simply forcing existing employees who are already working ridiculous hours to work more, it's not reasonable in the short term, but over the long term, it's not sustainable. These are two companies that have the country over the barrel. They're trying to force the government to do something that they don't want, which is to ignore the constitutionally protected right to strike and bargain collectively. And honestly, like what I see is two companies dominated by American executives who are used to playing by a different set of rules, and they want to import Alabama to Canada. And I do sympathize with the federal government, but for me, honestly, this is another reason for us to reconsider this whole notion of putting such important infrastructure in the hands of price gouging, profit-seeking corporations. I mean, the UK has just talked about renationalizing their rail service for the very same reasons. Based on the kind of bad behavior we've seen from CN and CP recently, I think that's a conversation that we need to have. We should not allow vital public infrastructure that's so vital to our country and our economy to remain in the hands of a bunch of foreign-owned corporations that are not looking after the public interest.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Gil McGowan with the Alberta Federation of Labour. Thank you, sir, for coming on and sharing that perspective.
Thanks, JP.
Just hours after the federal government ordered the labour dispute to arbitration, the union representing workers at CN served the company with a 72-hour strike notice.
The best way to have a contract is at the bargaining table. We don't believe to let a third party to decide what's going to be our working condition. We will use our constitutional right to fight the company here. So we are here, and we're going to stay here.
I should note that we did reach out to the union for an interview, but no one was made available to us today. So for reaction on the strike notice, Jonathan Abacasis is the Director of Public Affairs and Media Relations at the Canadian National Railway. They were willing to come on and talk to us about this today. Sir, I want to get your reaction to the Alberta Federation of Labour. You just heard Gil McGowan there. He says that by sending this labour issue to arbitration, Ottawa is rewarding a foreign-owned cartel for bad behaviour. What's your reaction to those strong words?
Excuse me. First of all, there's a lot to unpack on what Gil said. Let's be clear. Our executives, including our chief executives, are predominantly Canadians. We are a Canadian-based company, talking to you from Montreal, where our headquarters are, and have been for the last 100 years. The other thing to remember is that we tried to get a deal at the table. We sincerely tried consistently putting forward offers that were good for employees, that were good for the economy, and that just made common sense. We offered better scheduling, that was rejected. We offered pay raises, that was rejected. We offered to pay employees by the hour, that was rejected. This is how we got here. At the same time, right now, our trains are operating specifically because of the order that was made last night, because CN proactively decided to lift its lockout in order to get the economy moving again and in order to be able to power the economy. It's not for any other reason than that, because sure enough, this morning, the union gave us at 10 a.m. a 72-hour lockout notice, a 72-hour strike notice. Mm-hmm. That's where we stand right now.
Yeah, so what's your reaction to that threat? Are you concerned about them downing tools? I mean, you say you're getting the trains moving today. I understand you told me yesterday it could take 3 to 5 days to actually get things back to a state of normal. And now you're facing the threat of more labor action. Are you concerned about this?
We're paying close attention and we're waiting to hear what the CIRB will say, that's for sure. But for us, our primary focus is on getting the economy moving again. We heard your journalists say so before. If you use it, touch it, eat it, chances are we moved it at some point. Everything goes on trains. And it's not just jobs that are directly linked with CN that are impacted. This is sawmill workers in BC. This is miners and oil patch workers in Alberta, farmers from across the prairies, people in northern Quebec that are working on natural resources, or port workers in Atlantic Canada that are impacted by this. For us, the important thing is to get the economy moving again. We tried to get a deal. We put forward 5 good offers over the last 9 months, and we got no response until last weekend, and the response we got wasn't even serious. That's how we ended up here.
I want to ask you about the Industrial Relations Board process, because obviously the minister has sent this arbitration request to them to review. They are at this hour still pursuing that request. But what I noticed in the actual order is that he's directing the board to resume operations at CP. And he doesn't mention your company by name in this order. Are you concerned? Does that leave you vulnerable to a strike action? And did you get what you needed from the federal government to resume operations and prevent a strike, given that you're not explicitly mentioned in this document?
Let's be clear. Most disputes in the past with this union have been settled through binding arbitration. Binding arbitration is a process where a third-party arbitrator takes a look at both sides and decides what's best for the overall economy. So we think that this is a good process. We think that this is a fair process. This is a process that the union has agreed to in the past. So we think that that is the best thing that can happen, as we didn't see a path forward after 9 months of attempting to get a deal. For us, the important thing is the minister made clear he was sending this to the CIRB, and for us, that allows us to have this forward-looking visibility to be able to run our business and not be under the threat of a possible shutdown at any given time under the union. We're going to wait to see what the CIRB has to say, and at that point, we're going to decide where we go from there.
The Teamsters said today that their demands of you are not insurmountable and that they, quote, remain available for discussion in order to resolve this matter without further work stoppage. Are you willing to make any compromises on, maybe giving them some more money for higher wages or giving them that flexibility they want when it comes to breaks, or maybe standing down on what they're calling a forced relocation policy? Are you prepared to fold on some of your demands?
We have been trying to negotiate an agreement for 9 months. We have made concessions. We have tried to engage with them. But the reality of it is that it takes two to negotiate. You can't negotiate with an empty chair. At first, the union was saying this was all about safety. The union was saying that we were trying to take away rest, when the opposite was in fact true. Now they're saying that this is about relocating employees. Right now, this is something that is allowed under voluntary relocation. I can't insist on that word enough. It is 100% voluntary. It would allow conductors or employees from one region to go to another if there is a labor shortage. It would provide them with a premium of $750 a week. It would also give them all expenses paid by CN. These are jobs that make $150,000 a year for engineers and $120,000 a year for locomotive conductors. And they work approximately 160 days a year, which is significantly less than the Canadian average.
Just very quickly.
For us,
Sorry, Jonathan, just very quickly, I have limited time. Would you, given the threat of a strike, would you expect the government to table back to work legislation if this goes south? Are you expecting them to step in with that sort of thing?
At this point, we're going to wait to see what the CIRB is going to propose. For us, the important thing is that we're going to get back to work and start powering the economy as quickly as possible.
All right, let's leave it there. Jonathan Abacasis with the Canadian National Railway. Thank you again for coming on. I also want to note again that we did reach out to the union for an interview, but no one was available to speak with us today. But CN willing to come on and make their case. Kamala